And if you don't know, I'm Rabbi Craig Lewis of Mitzvah Congregation, and just my honor to be one of the conveners of this group. And I know Michael Dzik from Federation. Federation's going to begin having a big hand in helping us to coordinate these meetings as well. And so Michael, we're glad to have you here and glad to be partnering with Federation to keep expanding what this group and what this dialogue is all about. Our topic this month for March is for Women's History Month. We're talking specifically about the women creating change as Harvard freshmen in the 1960s and today. And really delighted to have two great speakers whose really the credentials speak for themselves, but I'm gonna speak them for them for a moment. Diane Irvine Fleet, who was the former chief legal officer for the University of Louisiana system and a former supervisory attorney, U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, and former senior attorney at Harvard University. And as Bill Maher says on his show, my old job, but he always says that jokingly. And also Deborah, I always get this wrong, Deborah Levine. We have so many Levines in my congregation, I have to go back and forth in my head. Deborah Levine, an award-winning author, I hope you've read at least one of her books, if not more, a founder of the American Diversity Report and a former American Jewish Community Executive in Chicago, and the former Jewish Federation Executive in Rockford, Tulsa, and Chattanooga. And yes, also from Bermuda originally. So really glad to have you here. Without any further ado, I'm going to give the floor, and Diane, give me a second. I will spotlight your video so that we can all focus on you. And Diane, welcome, and thank you for being here, and look forward to hearing you what you have to say. You can unmute.
Okay, I just unmuted myself. As I said, I'm a little bit technically challenged. But anyway, I'm delighted to be here today. As I mentioned earlier, Deborah and I go way back to college, and this has given us an opportunity to do a lot of reminiscing. But I will just sort of tell you a little bit about myself, and then we can open it up for discussion after Deborah gives her presentation. I was actually born and raised in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Very few people have that distinction. It was at a time when the South was segregated. My family goes back at least, from what I've been able to find, 2 centuries in this area. All of my great-grandparents were born, and my grandparents and my parents in and around Baton Rouge. So we're really kind of Baton Rougeans from way back. And I have found relatives as I've been beginning to do more genealogy that go back at least a couple of centuries. The men in my family were mostly skilled craftsmen and builders, since these were the best available opportunities for Black men in this area. The women were mostly homemakers and seamstresses, or had other similar kinds of positions outside of the home. Some of the women, like my Aunt Clara, went to college during World War II and became educators. And they worked in segregated schools in Baton Rouge. That was one of the few career options available to them. I knew from an early age that this was not for me, and I wanted to do something different. I really thought about being a doctor. My early ambitions were reinforced in high school, especially through a couple of summer experiences. I was selected to attend a special enrichment program for minority students at Knoxville College in Tennessee, and the following summer at Phillips Andover Academy, which was the first time that females attended any programs at Andover. No one I knew had gone to an Ivy League school, but a teacher at Andover suggested that I apply to Radcliffe. So I did, and that's when I met Deborah. Freshman year, I took chemistry thinking that this major would prepare me for med school because I still kind of had that in the back of my mind as what I wanted to do. But I changed my mind, and there were several reasons for that. Harvard was not a particularly friendly place for women in science. In fact, some instructors, some professors, and teaching assistants were actually hostile towards women. There were no women instructors in chemistry and very few in any of the science classes. In fact, they would put one of us in each of the small groups if they could find enough of us to at least have one, but you could count on not having another woman in your small group. So you were stuck in labs with all men. And I became much more interested in other things. The 60s, that happened to be a big time for social change and for civil rights activism. And I became more interested in social issues. So instead of majoring in chemistry, I opted to major in psychology, which was then part of what was called the social relations department. And I think it's been renamed several times since then. Historically, at that point in time, Radcliffe had very few Black women. There were perhaps a handful in each class. I was counting 4 or 5 in each class, including my own. I think we had 5. There were no Black women in my dorm, no Black women in any of my classes freshman year. I did eventually see some, so I knew they were there, but in very limited numbers. And of course, there was no official outreach to Black students, and this was before the Black Students Association was formed. That happened a bit later. In fact, there were so few Black women that I had the distinction of participating in the first sit-in at a Seven Sisters school. A very small group of us sat in at Radcliffe. We were protesting the low enrollment of Black women and decided that this was the way to get their attention. I later joined efforts to get a Black Studies department at Harvard. And of course, this was a time of anti-war activism as well. It was a very socially active period at Harvard and at many colleges throughout the country. After college, I realized I was not ready to go back to school. I wasn't even sure what I wanted to do next. So I went to work in a storefront doing health and education projects for the Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation in Brooklyn, New York. And I worked on things like educating the community about sickle cell anemia and advocating for more research and treatment in that area. I spearheaded mass testing for lead poisoning in children. There were lots of older buildings there, and lead poisoning was a very real and serious issue. And I worked on eradicating lead-based paint in housing. I worked with healthcare organizations to get dialysis facilities in Black communities And I worked on literacy issues and created the first Reading is Fundamental program in Brooklyn. After 3 years in Bed-Stuy, I thought I wanted to have more impact on policy issues because to me, this is where change had to start. So I then attended Yale Law School. After graduation, I worked in a New York international law firm and a Fortune 500 corporation, got that out of my system, found that corporate law was just not for me. I felt much more comfortable in academia, but rather than teaching or research, I was really interested in policy issues and kind of being a part of the conscience of the institution, for lack of a better way of characterizing it. So I worked in areas such as discrimination, immigration, sexual harassment, disability law. Um, and it was it turned out to be the right home for me. Some of the kinds of things I did during this period, I proposed and developed a research and development fund for women at City University of New York, which was part of a large settlement of a sex discrimination case. It was one of the early big ones in academic communities. I served as Dean for Faculty Relations at City College, which was also part of CUNY. I was a senior university attorney at Harvard and also served as an advisor to a number of student organizations. I served as general counsel for the University of Louisiana system, and I headed a policy group that drafted sexual harassment guidance for the Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights in Washington. So doing the higher education law, which actually has become a specialty over the years, was really the right fit for me. And I feel like I got to do a lot. Currently, I'm engaged in some higher education consulting and volunteer work with a prisoner reentry organization and also with the National Association of College and University Attorneys. So that's kind of what I've been doing with my life. And I guess I'll leave it at that until we open it up later for discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think there's so many avenues to continue to discuss. Deborah, let's hear. I mean, I think a lot of us know a lot of your background, but I bet there's some things that we're going to learn from what you share.
Sure. My background is quite different from Diane's, but we both ended up working around social change issues, equity issues, despite the fact that I was not even brought up in this country, brought up in Bermuda, British colony at the time. And my grandparents and grandparents had come over from Eastern Europe, the Russian Pale, and ended up in New England, which is certainly not the South, right? And as early as the 1880s. Although I was born in Brooklyn and I was always American citizen, I definitely was a Bermudian to begin with, and the only Jewish family to have lived on the island for 4 generations. My grandfather had only an 8th grade education, but he was an enthusiastic salesman, entrepreneur, traveling by horse and buggy up into the Black neighborhoods to sell goods in a very segregated time on the island, and hiring the first Black woman in a front office in the 1940s, when he became one of Bermuda's first professional realtors. He was always a futurist in his thinking. And he sent both of his girls to Bermuda schools. My mom went to the Bermuda High School for Girls, and both of them went to Ivy League schools back in New England. Mom went to Radcliffe, where she pioneered special education and where she met my dad, also a first generation American born, who studied history and literature before going into the Army as a military intelligence officer. He had originally intended to be a professor, but after the war, what he saw, he went back to Bermuda and joined the family business there. And so like my mother, I attended Bermuda High School for Girls. And when we came to America, I wasn't very happy. My mother took me along with her as her aide when she became a Hebrew school teacher at Rockdale Temple on Long Island, so I feel more at home. I was still not entirely convinced, and I set up a cardboard box on the sidewalk outside our house with a sign that says, "Learn proper English here." Yeah, that went over well. So my mom and dad decided to take me places where I would resonate as an American. And so I got to see everything from the Rockettes to Broadway. I played the classical violin. I loved the arts. I thought, okay, this place isn't so bad. It would be part of my career to start teaching, even if it was proper English, very early on. And I taught ballet in a high school in the Black neighborhood next door to where we lived. And I did study math, advanced math, ever since 4th grade, but I thought of myself as a poet and a philosopher. And I never expected to get into Radcliffe any more than Diane probably did, and because I explored everything and my grades showed that I was spread too thin. What I didn't realize was that my writing skills enabled me to produce really nice essays for the application process. And I've kept those essays in my files to this day. So freshman year, I took classes about writing. Well, actually I didn't. I was required to take a year-long writing class. Diane, do you remember when they pulled us all in and they gave us this writing test? And if you didn't—
Expository writing.
Yes, and if you didn't know enough to look at the end of the exam where they had all the directions, you failed, no matter how good your writing was, and you were required to take, for no credit whatsoever, a year-long writing course. Did you get caught like that too, Diane?
Yes.
I remember the guy next to me saying, "You're really an idiot, aren't you?" So,
I didn't have a clue.
We got caught. There was a lot of that. Being at Harvard was like being at intellectual boot camp. And really, it was an experience where everything you did could turn out badly. However, I did not expect, right, that I would be hit on by teaching assistants telling me that, "Oh, honey, you don't need to know that for this class. You don't need to know that for anything." Right. And I did not expect to have somebody, a gentleman, tell me, "You people," referring to Jews, "you people have come a long way." Well, I had kind of a temper back in those days, and my response was, "My people were writing the scriptures while yours were drawing in caves." That went over well, yeah. Well, it was an interesting development. Yes, there were more than one Jew in the dorm, and we all kind of were put together under our senior sister, Jessica Tuckman, and it was probably for a good reason. So one of the things that that came up with this was I wanted to study religion. And I went over to the Harvard Divinity School and enrolled myself in courses there. I didn't know you weren't supposed to as a freshman. I've never really paid attention to the limits, let's face it. And I got into a little bit of an argument with the person who taught Old Testament. His name was Frank Cross. He was also in charge of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is a rather controversial thing at the time. I didn't realize how controversial until he and I got into it. And I realized how different it was to study the scriptures from a Christian and a Jewish point of view. I eventually switched to cultural anthropology just to save myself. It was a difficult time, as Diane said, and it was a time when Harvard and Radcliffe decided to merge. Right? It had never merged before. We weren't always welcome. We were very small. And when we went into the research library at Lamont for the first time, there was graffiti on it saying, "Cliffies go home." Yeah. And there was no women's bathroom. They had crossed out the men's, written women. My friend Carol Potter went in there. There was still the urinals, and some guy was probably not totally appropriate for this dialogue. At any rate, he came running out screaming, and Carol Potter just kept on going. She says, "I don't see why I have to run out. I belong here." Yes, you do, Carol. She eventually became the mom in the TV show 90210. Yes. Well, there was a time of anti-Vietnam War thing. It was also a time of women's liberation. I got on a bus in the middle of the night to join an anti-war movement march down Fifth Avenue. I did the same for the Women's Liberation March, the first one down Fifth Avenue also. It was a time of activism. Some of you may know that my roommate was Senator Eugene McCarthy's daughter, Mary. And as my father said, "Kid, you're going to learn more than you ever thought you would." And we did, about social change. So when I graduated, it was difficult to get a job at those times. We had an economic difficulty. And I volunteered to match people, young people in Harlem, with mentors from Wall Street. Until I had to really find a job. And the only job I could find was a secretary and a file clerk. I was a very good file clerk. You can ask my boss at Sports Illustrated, which amused everyone since I knew nothing about sports. But it also meant that I worked in the garment district, which is where I learned to make coffee. And I decided that it would be good to go with my family when we moved to Cincinnati. And that's where I started my next career as a librarian at Hebrew Union College. But my health was not that great, and I had to kind of do things differently and be an entrepreneur and have my own consulting business so that I would have the flexibility. And I decided to go back into the arts. And so I created a Baroque dance company, loved history, and a dance studio in a school for the deaf. My mom had pioneered special education. It was part of who I was. Eventually, after I married and had my adorable daughter, right, I finished an urban planning degree that I had started, and I designed it because I didn't see what I wanted, just as I didn't see what I wanted at Radcliffe, a major in world religions, and so I had to kind of work the bureaucracy to get what I wanted. And this time I was able to design it for arts and culture, particularly in economic development in disadvantaged neighborhoods. This time I was in Chicago. And when I graduated, again, it was difficult to find the kind of job that I wanted. Even though I was the only staff person in a community nonprofit in downtown Chicago, they would not allow me to call myself executive director. And the next woman they hired after me was likewise not allowed. Then they hired a guy. They made him executive director. I was kind of upset, and I decided to go back to my roots and look at becoming part of the Jewish, what I call civil service. And I joined the American Jewish Committee there and became their interreligious affairs director. I didn't know why. Apparently, though, no one else on the staff wanted to do that kind of work. It's not easy. But to me, it was normal. I grew up being the only Jewish girl on the island. Let's go for it. And so that started a whole new career where I was able to work with rabbis, pastors, priests, the nuns, the heads of all kinds of religious groups of different color, nationalities, faiths. And eventually I would create my own, the DuPage Interfaith Resource Network, which is still going these days, okay? And continue on pulling people together in new ways, having discussions, creating things, and documenting them. That's why I've written 15 books. And letting other people document them too, and giving people a voice, which I've done through the American Diversity Report for 15 years. When I decided to move on to become an executive director, I really wanted that title. I ended up in Rockford, Illinois. One of the most memorable things about it is creating a video on the Holocaust for educators, for the use in the classroom, and getting to interview Holocaust survivors and liberators. I was just amazed. And that's why I took the job in Tulsa after the bombing in Oklahoma City, to see for myself what the neo-Nazi system and white supremacists were doing on native soil. Many of you know that my father was assigned to interrogate Nazi prisoners of war during World War II. I didn't know that until I got to Tulsa. And he was scared for me, and he told me all that he had done, and that he had kept his letters, which I've put in my books so that people can see them for themselves. And that's what I want to do. I want to make history come alive. I want to come and blend people together, to harmonize, not homogenize. And that's why I created this dialogue last summer. And one of the things that has been wonderful to me is that, you know, we circle back, we get to see Diane again. We get to compare notes about what it was like and what we have overcome over the years, and how similar, despite our backgrounds, our paths have been in trying to make a difference. And the best is yet to come. Right, Diane? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Deborah and Diane. I'm going to take off the spotlight so that it'll go to the speaker view. Or maybe not. Here we go. I got it. Remove spotlight. Okay. So real quickly, I know we're going to open up the floor to some discussion or some questions. I have one question I wanted to start with, and you talked about obstacles, and I thought from both of you, what's one major obstacle that you personally, I guess, have felt that you cleared on the topic, but also maybe what's one obstacle that you think we collectively have yet to clear that you'd like to keep working at? Purposely open-ended.
Go ahead, Diane.
I'm thinking. I think, and this may sound a little strange, but surviving that whole Ivy League experience intact was certainly initially an obstacle.
Yeah.
That I think I ended up doing a pretty good job of dealing with it. What I see happening now is that people are still having to go through a lot of the same stuff.
Yeah.
And that's still a big obstacle. We still have limited opportunities. We still have what I would call a failure to welcome people, different people, to the table. And I'm hoping we can make some progress on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Andy Simon says here, the big question is why? I didn't see there. Humans are so tribal. That's definitely a big part of the answer. Deborah.
Oh, I think that tribalism is very key. I will say, however, that my friends who are Native Americans have asked me not to use that word because it's theirs and they don't want it to be kind of hijacked. And I respect them. And that's one of the things that I think we need in these days, especially as we're so much online and we just don't understand each other. We don't hear all these things, and we are making, we're putting up tremendous barriers because of our biases. And we've always had biases as part of human nature, but they were played out, interestingly, at Harvard back in the day, when there were very few women faculty members in any area, in any academic area, not just the sciences. They were not there. So if we don't have people you can look up to as something you want to be, then how do you aspire to be it? And I think we're still in that. And how did I overcome those things and create all the things that I've done? I'm not sure where creativity comes, but I do know that if you channel your frustration and anger into something creative, you can make a difference instead of just being irate and sending off nasty tweets.
Creativity with a healthy dose of chutzpah. Healthy dose of chutzpah.
Yes. It's and the term social entrepreneur has become a thing. It certainly wasn't when we were young, but I think that captures it a bit too.
Great, thank you. Any questions or thoughts from everybody here?
I have a question.
Is it Deborah Ashton?
I have a question, but that wasn't me. So someone else, let them come in, and then I'll come in second.
Okay. So by the way, so there is a hand raise function. I forgot to mention that. That if you go under reactions on the bottom of your screen, there's a little button there that says raise hand. You can click on that, and that way it'll be easier to call on people because otherwise it's impossible to see everyone.
Okay.
Okay. I see. Okay. So Christina and Deborah. I think Deborah, you were first, and then we'll go to Christina.
No, I think it was Christina because I think she said I have a question. Was that
okay.
not?
That's fine. I just can't see the screen. Christina, please.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes, you can hear me. There's a quote that I remember from Shirley Chisholm, and I actually really quickly looked it up because I would love to know what you think, Diane, of what Shirley Chisholm said. This is a quote from an article written in 1969. She said, there are certainly reasons why more women are not involved. This country, as I said, is both racist and anti-feminist. Few, if any, Americans are free of the of the psychological wounds imposed by racism and anti-feminism. And as I was remembering, and I hope I'm remembering correctly, she felt that that sexism was actually more of an obstacle for her than racism. And I just wondered what you, if you could speak to that, what your experience is of that, if, specifically.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. Certainly, I found this when I was both in when I first got to Radcliffe, and I thought about it, Deborah. There were only 2 women who were ever my instructors. And I was in what should have been a female oriented area. And the men were still, I mean, you still felt it. You felt more, I felt more the sexism of being in that place. And certainly this was true in law school. At that point in time, when I was at Yale, 15% of my class were women. And that was off the charts high. I mean, this was the highest percentage of women in any law school in the country. And we would still, I never remember in job interviews references to race that were, direct, but certainly there were those that were sexual. I mean, you would have men saying, "Oh my goodness, there are all these women. I can't get over it." Or I remember being in one interview and the interviewer, who was a senior partner at a law firm, said, "Oh, it's too bad I'm not in law school now." So you really, also I had men to directly say to me, "You don't need to get paid as much as a man because you don't have to support a family." So I worry certainly during the pandemic as women are taking on more of the family roles that we're going to see a resurgence of a lot of this.
Thank you.
Big concern. We have, I don't know, just going in the order that I see them on the list now. Deborah Ashton.
Yeah, and that was Christina, Diane, who had asked the first question.
Yeah.
No, I was just letting Diane, because she said Deborah, so I wanted her to know that was Christina. Okay, and Diane and Deborah, I take it you were at Radcliffe from 68 to 71 or 67 to 71?
66.
66
to 70.
70. Okay. I went to Harvard for grad school starting in 72.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Let me share with you 2 things. First of all, I found out, and I tell folks, before I went to Harvard, I didn't think sexism existed. I literally thought it was a decoy so folks didn't have to deal with racism and classism in the United States of America. But I have to tell you, I went to an all-girls Catholic high school and an all-women's Catholic college. So I wasn't dealing with sexism because I didn't have to in those environments. When I went to Harvard, 2 things. One is I realized sexism existed because there were professors who were sexually harassing women students. B, racism still was running rampant. We had a chair of a department who would start student faculty meetings saying that Black people had no business in graduate school. And the other piece, I still remember one Black male who was there who was ahead of me in class saying how you handle the white professors if they start doing anything with racism, you scream castration. I said, I can't do that. And so it was interesting. And yes, when talking about when you graduated, when I graduated with a doctorate, the men were being offered directorships and being offered VPs, and the women were not. We were lucky if we got something with a manager's title. And when Christina asked about pay, and Diane, you also talked about pay, is to this day, sexism, even though racism is horrible, and let me be clear, racism is horrible, there's issues around pay where Black women and Latinas, we buy for last place on the pyramid when education is held constant. So even though racism, because you're more likely if you're Black to be stopped driving while Black, but as far as pay is concerned, women get paid the least. That's my spiel, and as saying goes, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
No, I found that certainly on the pay thing, it was very overt.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as I said, one man actually said to me, "I don't have to pay you as much because you're a woman."
Because you're a woman.
And this came from a Black man.
Oh yeah. Listen, we know it cut across race and gender.
You know,
I mean, because there's also women who believe that women should be paid less. Let's forget about that as well.
I like to
interesting comment about the seat of power. Sometimes, if you're in a position of influence, then you sort of assert one of those isms, unfortunately, or you can fall victim to asserting an ism. I'm sorry, Deborah, I cut you off.
Yeah, I wanted just to say that there are many, many women who are entrepreneurs, and people think it's wonderful, and it is. But one of the reasons why there are so many female entrepreneurs is because it's one of the ways in which to get out from under this sort of organizational, systemic kind of stereotyping and lack of opportunity and putting people forward. So, like myself, I created the path and walked it without going through the corporate world. It does hamper you somewhat, but when you have come from a time of such incredible difficulty in being female and you have ambition, it's really a good way to go. And I recall that there in one of the smaller seminar rooms at Harvard, and it was a female graduate student in charge. She asked the group, which was all male except 2 women, she asked the group, "What do you think of this new women's liberation movement?" The guys all laughed, and one of them said, "I don't understand why we ever let them even vote." So you get the idea there, that you're kind of going to be on your own. And it gives you a sort of do or die mindset, which isn't all bad. I don't like that it happened, but Diane and I have made the most of it, that's for sure.
Man, okay. A couple more people I see have their hands up. Leah Brockert.
Hi. I just wanted to see what your reaction was to the Georgetown law professor who was just fired because she was caught on tape disparaging the Black students in her class and saying how they were like at the bottom of the rung. Have you heard about that, or what are your thoughts about that? I'm not sure. I think Georgetown, I don't know if it's considered Ivy or not, but it's certainly a prestigious university, Georgetown Law, and that she was caught on this kind of hot mic moment feeding into the stereotypes that, Black students aren't doing as well as the rest of the students, taking that into consideration with the sexism we were just talking about. This is a female law professor, which obviously isn't as common. So just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
I was pretty horrified to hear that at this point in time, a woman would say something like that, or anyone would say something like that. But but then on the other hand, the more things change, the more they unfortunately have remained the same. And one of the horrible things that I recall from my time in law school is that there were clearly people who voiced that somehow the Black students who were there didn't belong there. Yeah, which was just, that does something to you. In addition to making you very angry, still to have this kind of sentiment, at times, this was actually said. And I guess I was very sad to hear that the same thing is happening now.
Tony Reed.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Just wanted to just raise, from your perspective, panelists and others, the role that you see the faith-based communities, particularly churches, have to play. I raise that because here in Bermuda, our local church, we're teaming up with the Jewish community of Bermuda to raise the awareness that local churches such as ours are relative to the Jewish community, and how we can partner with the Jewish community to keep their issues at the forefront, of that we can come alongside to help, whether with anti-Semitism or racism, or where we're seeing they are attacking the local press, or whatever it may be. I'm just curious to know your guys' position on that.
Well, Tony, are you involved at all in the recent Holocaust exhibit going on in Bermuda? Tony?
Oh, he's probably still muted.
Is he still muted? Okay. I don't see him. Oh well.
So Deborah, what is the role of faith-based communities then? What do you think?
Well, the connection between churches and synagogues and other faith-based organizations, I think, is a very strong one in terms of looking at social change and community building. It always has been. When we created the DuPage Interfaith Resource Network, it was back in 1990, right? And there were street riots over the display or lack of display of Christmas work in schools. The idea that we could come together over difficult issues was absolutely necessary. And I think that we have continued that interfaith coalition building even today. Now, it has had its ups and downs, as you all know. Sometimes it's really, really impactful, and other times it seems to fall apart. But I think that it has within it the basis for a lot of dealing with all of these issues, whether it's racism or whether anti-Semitism, the issue of women, the issue of equity. The government isn't necessarily going to address it all at once, but religious organizations can. And
I'll just chime in with that too, just as a faith leader, that the role is still as significant and important as it ever was, because you have to speak with that prophetic voice and speak truth to power and so on. And just since the 60s, there's been a precipitous decline in faith organization involvement in America in general. So that limits what we're actually able to accomplish relative to what faith-based organizations were able to do then. So I think that there's room to build and keep growing. And I think that's part of why maybe there's been not stagnation, but I guess it slowed down some. But I think we also have to also say faith-based organizations can't carry the load as the way we used to. But we also have to keep engaging people and stay at the hard work. Anyhow, that's a couple other folks here. Andy, Simon.
Thank you, Craig. And thank you, Deborah, for inviting me today. This is really wonderful. I wanted to point out some things that progress is difficult to experience when we've all had some of these experiences in our lives. So I have a new book out, but in it I highlight the fact that there are 40% of the attorneys today are women, but only 25% are equity partners. And of those, less than 5% are people of color, and only 4% are Black women, and they have the highest attrition rate. So that you see some progress, but not others. The students graduating from fashion schools, Fashion Institute, Pratt, are all women, but only 16% of the management of the fashion industry are women. The rest are all guys, and less than 25% of the boards are. Most of the folks who do the work now are women, and the men who manage the staffing organizations or the schools are controlling it. So we see an interesting, if you step back and look, I'm an anthropologist, you look at society and you say there's a transition happening. What are we going to do to flip this and create a more equitable parity society? You can look at dots, or you can begin to look at patterns. More than half the doctors are women, but they're not in the surgeons and they're not running the hospitals. 65% of the students in colleges are women. But only a third of the colleges are being run by women, and usually they're the ones in most trouble. I loved at Citibank, they put Jane Fisher in there because it's a troubled institution. We become the fire department for turning things around. So there's something going on that if we look at the patterns, we might state there's a sea change coming, but now we've got to push over that hurdle and create that equity that we're looking for. And that's going to mean a whole lot of social and cultural changes right down to the way we raise our kids. So I want to put that out there because we sometimes get lost in the dots. And on the other hand, that's what we experience. But there's something else going on here. So my thoughts.
Lee Rosenberg.
Hi, this question was for Diane Fleet. I was kind of shocked when I heard that you mentioned you were involved with a lawsuit at City College with CUNY. I always, and maybe I'm naive to this, or maybe it's how CUNY is today, I always thought that the CUNY system was designed to provide higher education for a more diverse student population, whether it was social or economic background, no matter what. So I was curious about that lawsuit. Maybe it was just different years ago.
Well, in fact, what's interesting about CUNY is that it was, even at the time of the lawsuit, way ahead of most institutions in the country.
Right.
A sex discrimination suit was brought against CUNY in the late 70s. This occurred. And I almost, in looking back, probably if you had to pick a school to bring this suit, this would have been at the bottom of the list because it was far ahead of most others. But there was still some discrimination going on.
Right.
You still had women not in as many positions of power, but later becoming in more positions of power there. Yes, CUNY was progressive, but this will show you how pervasive the discrimination was.
I see. No, thank you.
Yeah.
I thought I was naive at one moment. I was like, that's not the CUNY I know today.
No, it's, you know, and CUNY, it really is very progressive. But it still had those elements of discrimination.
Wow.
But if you looked at the statistics then, it was still far ahead of most other institutions. It just happened to be the one that got sued.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? We are right at 5 o'clock. I think we have a couple minutes if there's something else. There's some great resources being shared in the chat room. Some articles.
Rabbi Craig, I just wanted to say that, just referring back to the question about, I think the gentleman also from Bermuda was asking about interaction with the Jewish community. I would love to see more. There is some, but I would like to see more interaction on a social justice level. And I think they've been slow to come forward. I'm not sure why. I was thinking maybe it was a fear of being known as Jews in the community. I'm not quite sure, but I would definitely love to see more interaction with them as far as social justice movements and their understanding and how they can, move towards a further oneness, with people of color or the community at large. So I just wanted to share that. And we're trying to move towards that, but
we have plenty of room. Part of this dialogue was created. I know Deborah and I, when we started talking about doing something like this, and then she reached out to her network and was to say we need to rebuild that relationship. I won't say it was broken, but it just, when I got to Chattanooga 4 years ago, it didn't seem like there was as many natural links as far as doing the social justice work together. Part of that is just lack of person power. We're a smaller community, and people we don't have as many people to do some of that work. And some of that is just we need focus and aim and a united purpose to build around. And I think we're working on that. I know with Michael Dzik and Federation getting involved, we expand our network out there. Social justice projects, we just got to get in the same room or same Zoom room, put our heads together, say, let's target something where we can get a win, and let's work on it.
Yes. And talk and dialogue is first and foremost, my goodness. But thank you. Thank you for everything you and Deborah are doing.
My pleasure. And I'm looking forward to doing more things that are more than just talk. We're actually doing activist type things.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I see some other comments popping up here.
Someone has their hand.
Yeah. Galaxy J3V. We'll let you have the last, I don't know your name, but your Galaxy J3V, you get the last question, sir.
Hi, just an observation. Can I be heard again?
Yes.
And that is, one of the things with the social justice, and I'll go back, and as a person of color, I am reminded that at the forefront of the civil rights movements were Jews. The involvement with the NAACP and, how that Martin Luther King and others, had marching beside them were Jewish leaders. And one of the things I think is important for us as communities is as we give support to each other, that we begin to support those things that are crucial for the beneficial improvement overall of our communities. And, the segmentation, by race, our color only divides. And the more that we come together, like we saw with the civil rights movement, with Dr. King and others, I think that, that's a good model for us to follow.
Amen. And I think that for me, I'm thrilled to know that like Abraham Joshua Heschel and Joachim Prinz were rabbis that were right there in lockstep with Dr. King. But I'm also sad that it was so long ago, and there aren't as many prominent names that I could name that have done that type of work. I mean, we have great people who've done great things, don't get me wrong. But if our prominent example is still, from the 60s, that means we got some work to do and working towards the present and the future. And Michael Dzik is plugging a film. Hang on. Shared Legacies. Amen. Okay. Well, friends, Deborah and Diane, I thank you so much for sharing your stories. I thank you all for being with us. I'm looking at the calendar. The second Sunday is the 11th. So we'll be looking at April 11th to have our next meeting at 4 p.m. And we'll be sending out information about topics and speakers.
And
All
the
right.
recording,
Thank you, everybody.
okay, and the recording of today's session will be up on the American Diversity Report and available if you want to share this and get other people involved in April.
May I ask, does anybody know what Sunday is Easter?
I think it's the 4th.
Okie dokie.
All I know, Easter's got to be early because Passover's early. So
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's the
Wait a
first.
minute. And as I tell folks, that's right. The 10 Commandment was always shown at Easter because they coincide.
you know which one came first. I'm just going to drop that there.
Very good. Okay, take care.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon or have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks.